introduce our speaker, Sally Fallon Morell. She's the founding president of the Weston A. Price Foundation. She's also the founder of a campaign for real milk. She's the author of the best-selling cookbook, Nourishing Traditions with Mary Enig, the Nourishing Traditions book of baby and child care with Thomas Cowan, Nourishing Broth, Nourishing Fats, and Nourishing Diets. She and her husband Jeffrey are owners of P.A. Bowen Farmstead, which produces raw cheese and milk from pastured cows, woodlands, pork, and grass-fed poultry and eggs in southern Maryland. And so I know we all feel like we know a lot about Sally, but I did ask her for a fun and interesting fact, and she said she had a brief stint as an interior designer. So please help me welcome Sally Fallon Morell.
Well, good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you here. Because we have so many distinguished speakers at this conference about the heart, about cardiology, I thought it would be good to pull this talk out of my suitcase and add it to this conference. So I'm inviting you to consider, I got to read this part, what they're telling us today. That in the past, we didn't have a lot of rich diets. We were poor, we were grubbing for plants, we ate lean meat. And according to what I call the diet dictocrats, the reason we have so much heart disease today compared to 100 years ago is because we've become very spoiled, rich, indulgent people. Eating lots of cholesterol and those terrible saturated animal fats that we did not used to eat. That's the premise. And so we have this new diet, rich, indulgent diet, and that's why the human beings have so much heart disease and also cancer and other diseases today. In fact, a recent book, or fairly recent, called The Paleo Diet, bases dietary recommendations on an interpretation of the diet of our so-called Paleolithic ancestors. And according to this author of this book, these ancestors were very politically correct. They ate meat, but not the terrible fats attached to the meat. And the kind of fats they ate were the healthy monounsaturated fats, and all the recipes in the book feature canola oil and olive oil. Before we begin, as a general guide so you can understand our terminology, there's three basic types of fats. Saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature. Butter, ghee, beef tallow, lard, coconut oil, and palm oil are saturated fats. Monounsaturated oils tend to be liquid at room temperature and become semi-solid in the refrigerator. Olive oil, peanut oil, and canola oil are common monounsaturated fats. And polyunsaturated fats are liquid even in the refrigerator. And so that includes corn oil, soybean oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil. These are polyunsaturated fats. So that's your chemistry lesson. So let's go back 100 years, in fact, a little bit more than 100 years, and look at how Americans were eating at the time. I have a cookbook published in 1895, put together by the Baptist Ladies of Monmouth, Illinois. Now, this collection of recipes is very interesting because it completely flies in the face of what the establishment is telling us, that the reason we have so much cancer and heart disease today compared to a century ago is because we are eating much greater amounts of saturated fats from animal foods. Yet in this little book, and by the way, you can get this book on Amazon, called the Baptist Ladies from Monmouth, Illinois cookbook. There's hardly a recipe in this book that does not contain butter, eggs, cream, or lard, beginning with the soup chapter and ending with the substantial array of desserts. Most meat recipes call for gravy made with the drippings and occasionally with added cream. Lean roasts are larded to give them fat. Now, it seems that in 1895, nobody had heard of al dente steamed vegetables. All the vegetable recipes in the book are cooked a long time, and many call for a sauce based on cream. In fact, the recipes often seem to be just an excuse for a sauce. The vegetable recipes include asparagus dressed in cream, 4 versions of cabbage with cream sauce, corn and eggplant fritters fried in lard, potato balls fried in good drippings, and parsnips fried in bacon fat. One of the things that foreign visitors to America noted in the 1700s and 1800s was that America was a butter-eating nation. We ate huge amounts of butter compared to Europeans. Observers stated that in America everything was swimming in butter, including porridge, soup, meat, vegetables, and pudding. We had a very rich land. We were a dairy nation, and we ate lots and lots of butter. It tasted good, and there were no crazy people to tell us that butter was sinful. So we just ate it. Okay? Seafood recipes in this little book include fish a la creme, scalloped fish, cream salmon, and cream fish. A sauce for broiled fish calls for 1 large spoonful of butter and 1 1/2 cups of cream. Now there's a whole chapter devoted to oysters. Americans ate lots of oysters compared to today, 2 or 3 times as many oysters as today. In the Midwest, they would come either brought on ice by train to Chicago or canned. Recipes for oysters include deviled oyster made with egg yolks, creamed oyster patties made with eggs and butter, oysters wrapped in bacon, scalloped oysters, oyster pie made with 1 quart of cream, oyster fritters fried in drippings, oysters fried in hot lard, and scalloped oysters made with butter and whole milk. There's a chapter on organ meats that includes fried veal liver and sweetbreads, both creamed and fried. A scrapple recipe calls for hog's head, heart, tongue, and part of the liver, was stored in a crock and covered with melted lard, and then the scrapple was consumed for breakfast, sliced and fried in lard. Then there are separate chapters for eggs and cream. Now eggs and cheese, excuse me. Now let's turn to the salads. There's only 1 salad recipe in this little book that calls for lettuce when available. Lettuce is a modern luxury, and in the past, people only had lettuce at certain periods of the year. And this leads me to my own particular theory about the cause of heart disease. It's caused by lettuce. You may laugh at this, but this conclusion is even more preposterous than the conclusion that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. And there's actually a very good explanation for my theory that lettuce causes heart disease, which I shall reveal later on, so you have to stay and listen to me. Okay? The other salad recipes feature apples, cabbage, ham, tongue, chicken, oyster, fruit, potato, veal, lobster, sweetbreads, shrimp, and nasturtiums. But what about the salad dressings? These are of great interest to us. The salad dressing for coleslaw features sweet cream. 3 salad dressings call for egg yolk, mustard, and vinegar. So egg yolk was used as the fat in the salad dressing. 1 recipe calls for olive oil or melted butter. If they didn't have, they probably didn't have olive oil in Illinois, so they used melted butter instead. Then there's another recipe that calls for 1 cup of whipped cream. There is, however, 1 salad recipe in this recipe book that calls for oil. Okay? This is the only time in this book that the word oil appears by itself. Americans at the turn of the century nourished themselves with butter, cream, egg yolks, and lard, not with vegetable oils. Some Italian communities may have used olive oil. Cottonseed oil was just beginning to emerge into the food supply. But basically, Americans used animal fats, even on salads. In addition to eggs, butter, cream, and lard, suet, which is beef fat, and other animal fats like chicken and duck fat, coconut meat, and oil supplied additional saturated fatty acids at the turn of the century diets. Highly saturated coconut oil was used for crackers and baked goods and advertised as being healthy. The Baptists were fond of rich desserts. Half the book is devoted to cakes, pies, ice cream, pudding, and donuts. The donuts are fried in lard, of course. 2 advertisements for dentists in the back of the book testify to the effect of sugar and white flour on their teeth. But cancer and heart disease were extremely rare before the turn of the century. People were sturdy and strong, but gross obesity was not a problem. Today, however, we're being told that saturated fat from animal sources and from the tropical oils are the cause of cancer, heart disease, and obesity. So what we're going to do in this presentation is focus on how this great change came about, how it was that Americans traded animal fats for vegetable oils and everything from baked goods to baby foods. And the title of this tall tale is The Oiling of America. Let's just summarize again the main types of fat. We have saturated fats, which are solid at room temperature. They're not solid in your body. What temperature is your body? 98 degrees, pretty warm. It's a very hot day when it's 98 degrees. Monounsaturated oils, and then the polyunsaturated oils, which are basically new to the modern diet. Now let's go to 1921, which is the date of the first recorded myocardial infarction in the United States. First recorded one. 1930, there were 3,000, and by 1960, it was an epidemic, 500,000, 500,000 U.S. deaths from myocardial infarction. Now, up to this time, there was some heart disease. It was usually heart failure that occurred after a very bad case of typhoid fever, but it certainly was less than 10% of all illnesses in the United States. Okay, we're at 1960. We have an epidemic here. Okay. One of the things that had changed in this time period was that Americans had shifted from animal fats to vegetable oils. And that started in 1913 when Procter & Gamble, the makers of Crisco, published the story of Crisco, little recipe book, in which they claimed that women who use Crisco rather than lard, and Crisco, by the way, means crystallized cottonseed oil. Okay, yeah, it was from cottonseed, and it started in the South because that's where the cotton was grown. So women who used Crisco rather than lard were more modern, more enlightened, had cleaner houses, and their children had better character than women who used lard. Okay? They knew how to punch all the buttons of the up-and-coming American housewife, and they created the impression that it was vulgar to use lard. Okay? And that to cook with lard, and it was very indulgent. You should feel quite guilty if you ate butter. Okay, so you have this new disease, and lots of it, and quite a frightening disease because people were just dropping dead, you know. It wasn't gradual like heart failure. And so they came up with this theory called the diet heart theory, or sometimes it's called the lipid hypothesis. And that is that Americans were eating a bad, indulgent, rich diet with too much cholesterol and saturated fat. And that caused the blood levels of cholesterol in the blood to go up. And this cholesterol in the blood was causing atherosclerosis, buildup of plaque in the arteries, and that all led to coronary heart disease. So the overarching theory was that our bad diet was causing this new disease, myocardial infarction. Now, if you are a scientist and you come up with a theory, and someone shows that this theory isn't true, you have to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new theory, okay? And in fact, in 1936, it had already been shown that there was no correlation between cholesterol levels in the blood and the degree of atherosclerosis. These were pathologists at Harvard University, and they analyzed the buildup of plaque in the arteries and took the cholesterol levels of people who died violent deaths, okay, usually in car accidents. And you can see there's no correlation at all. This is kind of a scatter graph. There were people with low levels of cholesterol who had a lot of buildup, and there were people with high levels of cholesterol with no buildup. So there was no correlation between cholesterol levels and atherosclerosis. So this part of the theory was disproven very early. But that didn't stop them. They continued on. As Tom would say, there's nothing scientific about modern science. So at the same time, let's see, let me go back a minute. Okay. So at the same time, there was a new organization that was formed. It was called the American Heart Association. And in 1956, they held a fundraiser that aired on all 3 television networks at the same time. Imagine having this much power. And the program featured medical doctors promoting the lipid hypothesis that, I'm going to have to get my notes here. Let's see. It's been such a long time since I gave this talk. Yeah, here we go. So in 1956, the American Heart Association held this fundraiser, aired on all 3 television networks at the same time. And these medical doctors were promoting the lipid hypothesis as the cause of heart disease and suggested that Americans should adopt the prudent diet, one in which corn oil, margarine, chicken, and cold cereal replace butter, lard, beef, eggs, and oatmeal and cream. Okay. Now this campaign was not an unqualified success because one of the panelists was Dr. Paul Dudley White, and he was the leading cardiologist in America. He was President Eisenhower's physician. And on public television, he noted that heart disease in the form of myocardial infarction was non-existent in 1900, when egg consumption was 3 times what it was in 1956. And when corn oil was unavailable. When pressed to support the diet hypothesis, he said, "See here, when I began my practice as a cardiologist in 1921, I never saw a myocardial infarction patient until 1928. Back in the MI-free days before 1920, the fats were butter and lard, and I think we would all benefit from the kind of diet that we had at that time, when no one had ever heard the word corn oil." Unfortunately, the words of Dr. White were soon forgotten, and the next step in this saga was something called the Anti-Coronary Club, which was founded in 1957, and it involved a group of New York businessmen, ages 40 to 59, in the prime of life, placed on the prudent diet of corn oil and margarine instead of butter, cold breakfast cereals instead of eggs, and chicken and fish instead of beef. Now there was a control group that ate of the same age that ate eggs for breakfast and meat 3 times a day. Well, the results came in 1966. The paper was published, and they noted that the prudent dieters had average serum cholesterol of 220 compared to 250 in the controls. So it was a success, right? The prudent diet lowered people's cholesterol. But when you read the fine print, and you have to put your glasses on, and there's a little paragraph at the very end of this study where they noted that in spite of having lower cholesterol, there were 8 deaths from heart disease among the prudent dieter group and none among the controls. So it was not a success, and this prudent diet was seemed to be causing heart disease. So the critics then said, well, this was only a small group. You needed a large group of people. And so the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute organized a study for 1 million men. And they started to stockpile all the food and everything. But a pilot study showed that this prudent diet was worthless. And so they abandoned the study for reasons of cost. They said this would be too expensive. Well, you may be asking yourself, who is pushing this theory in the face of contradictory evidence? There is a lobby group in Washington, D.C. that you've never heard of called the Institute for Shortening and Edible Oils. You know, they say that the meat lobby or the milk lobby are so powerful, but this is a very powerful group and nobody knows about them, and they don't want anyone to know about them. So they were working behind the scenes. Now, the American Heart Association kind of straddled the fence at this point, and they had come up with a printed statement. They published a lot of these papers that they were going to distribute. And it said that maybe we should look at these things called trans fats. Maybe this is what's causing these heart attacks, and they're new to the diet, and maybe we should get rid of them. Okay, but Dr. Fred Mattson worked for Procter & Gamble. He worked behind the scenes to get the American Heart Association to remove this statement, and in fact they just destroyed all these papers, started again, and removed any reference to trans fatty acids, and in fact encouraged their consumption. They called this supervision. Okay, they were supervising. Then in the 1960s, this lobbying group supervised, worked behind the scenes. The American Heart Association, the National Heart and Lung and Blood Institute, and the American Dietetic Association to get their people on their boards of directors to influence their policy. In 1971, you can see how this is progressing. The FDA's General Counsel became president of the Edible Oil Association, and he was replaced at the FDA by a food lawyer named Peter Barton Hutt of Covington and Burling, who had represented the edible oil industry. So we call this the revolving door policy. And also in the 70s and 80s, this same man, Mattson, held 2 controlling positions in the Lipid Research Clinic trials, which we're going to talk about in a moment, that led to the National Cholesterol Education Program. Strangely enough, the American Medical Association opposed the lipid hypothesis. In a news release of 1962, they said the anti-fat, anti-cholesterol fad is not just foolish and futile, it also carries some risk. Scientific reports linking cholesterol and heart disease attacks have touched off a new food fad among do-it-yourself Americans. But dieters who believe they can cut down on their blood cholesterol without medical supervision are in for a rude awakening. It can't be done. It could even be dangerous to try. But by the early 70s, the American Medical Association had come around, had succumbed to this supervision. And in these years, these 3 organizations, the AMA, American Heart Association, National Association of Science, published a statement about heart disease and what was causing it. And they first of all said that the cholesterol levels of Americans were too high. They were undesirably elevated, and it was important to lower cholesterol levels in the blood. It was important to measure cholesterol, and they had come up with easy way of measuring cholesterol in the blood. And it should be part of routine physical examinations, even in early adulthood. The dietary advice was that Americans in the risk category should receive appropriate dietary advice. Now, they didn't say who was at risk, and they didn't say what this dietary advice was, except that Americans should reduce the intake of saturated fat by substituting polyunsaturated vegetable oils. Does this sound like a marketing campaign? And they're getting doctors and scientists, the people that Americans really respected, to do their advertising for them. These statements contain the following sentence, or two sentences. Modified and ordinary foods useful for this purpose should be readily available on the market, reasonably priced, and easily identified by appropriate labeling. Any existing legal and regulatory barriers to the marketing of such foods should be removed. And here's the clincher. We need more studies, right? Even though they're suggesting a radical change in the American diet, a kind of diet that no human population had ever consumed anywhere in the world, without a lot of study. They were just putting this out there. So the existing legal and regulatory barriers, what were they? It was something called the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. It said if a food was an imitation food, you had to have the word imitation on the label. And the food industry was coming up with a lot of imitation foods, and this was the barrier to them. So Peter Barton Hutt, who had just gone to the FDA, he got rid of this. He got rid of the imitation policy and attempted to provide for advances in food technology, all these new imitation foods, and to give manufacturers relief from the dilemma of either complying with an outdated standard or having to label their new products as imitation. So who is this going to benefit? Not going to benefit the consumer. It's going to benefit the food industry. The regulation defined inferiority as any reduction in content of an essential nutrient that is present at a level of 2% or more of the US RDA. So what that meant was if you came up with an imitation cream, you would have to add calcium and vitamin A because these nutrients were much reduced in these imitation foods. This new imitation policy of 1973 opened the floodgates to processed food in this country and got rid of the imitation label. The Americans didn't want imitation foods. They'd gone through the Second World War. They were had this period of great prosperity, a lot of shift in population to the cities, and they wanted real food. They were eating better, they wanted real food. So you couldn't put imitation on the label. Well, you can see it just is so clear that this is being planned in the background to get Americans to eat these newfangled industrial seed oils. And the next step was the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs. It was chaired by George McGovern, and it actively promoted the lipid hypothesis. There were thousands of pages of dissenting testimony, all of which was ignored. The final report claimed that USDA data showed that animal fats cause and vegetable oils prevent cancer and heart disease. Now, at this time, my colleague, mentor, and co-author, Mary Enig, was at the University of Maryland working on her PhD, and she was very familiar with USDA data. And she knew that the data did not show this. And through a FOIA request, Freedom of Information request, she got the data that the committee had used. And she found some very strange things, like big chunks of data were left out, or they added in some places when they should have subtracted. So it was, lots of cheating on this data to get this conclusion. And she was able to get published a small article in an obscure journal saying this, that the USDA data showed that it was the vegetable oils and the trans fats that were associated with the increase in heart disease. Well, when this article came out, it got a lot of publicity. It was reported on in every newspaper in the country, even in the National Enquirer. So a few weeks later, she was invited to a meeting at the University of Maryland with the graduate students and her professors. There were about 4 or 5 very qualified professors in lipids at the University of Maryland. And there were 4 representatives from industry there. One from Central Soya, one from Procter & Gamble, one was from the Institute for Shortening and Edible Oils. I'm not sure who the 4th one was. But one of them had a big pile of newspaper clippings. This was before the internet, and you had clipping services. And his hands were shaking with rage. And he said, look at the publicity you've gotten on this article. He said, we watch the journals to make sure nothing against our industry is ever published. What an admission. Okay. And he said, I thought my colleague was watching this journal, and he thought I was watching this journal, and we left the barn door open, and a horse got out. Okay. So Mary's article was not supposed to be published, but it was. And by the way, the editor of the journal then retired immediately afterwards. So, but it was really eye-opening for her. And they said, this will never happen again. And if you keep talking this way, you will never get any research grants. And that's what happened. She never got any research grants. So she kept working on her own, but she was ostracized. Her head was chopped off, as we say. So in spite of Mary's brave efforts, this report and the accompanying publicity, the report got lots of publicity, continued American dietary trends toward more vegetable oils and less animal fat. But the medical profession actually remained skeptical of the value of cholesterol-lowering measures. That didn't last long, but they were still skeptical. Now what I'm going to do, so they came out with a booklet about why we should be lowering our cholesterol and avoiding saturated fats. And in this booklet were 3 studies. They just cited 3 studies in this booklet to prove that we should be doing this. The first was the 40-year Framingham study, where they looked at this town of Framingham and correlated disease incidence with various factors. And when they published the final report in the American Heart Journal, they said that it was cholesterol levels in the blood. And this was the graph that they came up with. And as you can see, it looks very scary. If your cholesterol is high, suddenly your risk for heart disease goes way up. Okay, heart disease events go way up. Anyone here ever taken statistics? Okay. Do you notice something strange about this graph? Look at the intervals. So the first interval is 121 points, and then you have 3 intervals of 30 points, and the last interval is 830 points. Now, if you had done this on your statistics exam, you would have gotten an F. Okay? This is cheating. Okay? I read you the graph with equal intervals of 100 points. It looks a lot different, doesn't it? Yes, you can see a slight rise in the risk there, but it's nothing scary. You know, it's not like this. So they cheated. They completely cheated. Okay. And when reporting this, they said the actual rate of increase is 0.13% between cholesterol levels of 182 and 244, which they said was a 240% increase in risk if your cholesterol level was 244 rather than 182. And by the way, the average cholesterol level of most people is about 250. That's the average cholesterol level. So not only did they cheat on the graph, But they invented a new factor or paradigm called relative risk. Relative risk versus absolute risk. And here's how this works. Suppose the heart disease death rate at 240 is 2 per thousand, and at 160 is 1 per thousand. The difference in rate, the absolute risk, is 1/1000th or 0.001%. But the difference in risk, the difference in relative risk, this new category here, is 100% because 2 is 100% greater than 1. Okay. Now suppose the death rate at 240 is 2 per million and at 160 is 1 per million. The difference in rate is 1/1,000,000th, but the difference in relative risk is still 100% because 2 is 100% greater than 1. Okay, you know what they've done? They've gotten rid of the denominator. Okay, now you may not have taken statistics, but you all took fractions. And if you got rid of the denominator, you'd get an F on your test. Okay, but they get away with this stuff. So cholesterol theory proponents usually exaggerate the benefits by reporting them in terms of relative risk, but minimize the side effects by reporting them in terms of absolute risk. This trick is still being used. If you're reading newspaper articles and you see this term relative risk, or even if you're just seeing a big percentage, like you take this drug and you're 50% less likely to get X disease, they're doing relative risk because you never find these huge differences in the studies. A few years later, they did a follow-up on Framingham, and this is what they really found in Framingham. They found that the more saturated fat one ate, the more cholesterol one ate, the more calories one ate, the lower people's serum cholesterol. We found that people who ate the most cholesterol, the most saturated fat, and the most calories weighed the least and were the most physically active. That was never reported in a newspaper. By the way, what they really found also was that the biggest risk factor for heart disease was uric acid in the blood. Kind of interesting. Okay, the second trial was called the multiple risk factor intervention trial, called Mr. Fit. So they have come up with very clever names for 362,000 men. And this is showing, they do have equal intervals here, but it's showing coronary deaths as the cholesterol rises, and there is a slight increase in risk when your cholesterol gets up to about 300. But the other thing it showed was that total deaths went way up when your cholesterol was low. And these deaths were from cancer, kidney disease, stroke was another one that went up with low cholesterol. So you could take your pick. You could die quickly from a heart attack, or you could die slowly and painfully from cancer and digestive disorders and kidney disease. This kind of paradox is found in many, many studies, that you're actually more at risk for disease when your cholesterol is low, especially cancer. Low cholesterol is a risk factor for cancer. So the final trial, and this was a very big trial, it was very expensive, the Lipid Research Clinics Coronary Primary Prevention Trial. The results were published in 1984. Cost 150 million taxpayer dollars, and one of the reasons it did is because they had two groups, the patient group and a placebo group, but both groups met with dietitians to be indoctrinated into adopting a low-fat diet. They were taught how to use vegetable oils. They were taught to eat breakfast cereal instead of oatmeal with cream. They were taught to eat chicken, skinless chicken breasts instead of roast beef. So all of these participants in the trial were, programmed to do this low-fat diet. And then one group got a cholesterol-lowering drug and one got a placebo. They were all on this low cholesterol, low saturated fat diet. Well, when the results came out, the researchers claimed that the group taking the drug had a 17% reduction in heart disease. And again, Mary Enig was waiting in the wings. She got the data they used, and she found no difference in heart disease between the drug and the placebo groups. The researchers claimed that the average cholesterol reduction was 8.5%, and that led to an oft-repeated statement by Rifkin, who was in charge of this trial. For each 1% reduction in cholesterol, we can expect a 2% reduction in coronary heart disease events. The group taking the drug had an increase in deaths from cancer, stroke, violence, and suicide. We find this pattern everywhere. But the media portray this as the long-sought proof that animal fats are the cause of heart disease. By the way, in the late 90s, Mary Enig and I were on a radio show, a very obscure radio show by the Seventh-day Adventists, talking about this trial and what they really found, why elders should eat butter and eggs and so forth. The very next week, this man, Rifkin, you know, a very busy man, has a lot to do, he came on the show to refute what we had said. He took time out to refute what we had said. They looked at the Framingham results later, 30 years later, and what they found was that people who had lower cholesterol had a greater risk of death. For each 1% drop in cholesterol, there was an 11% increase in coronary and total mortality. So these were the three studies that were used to justify this new policy of the low-fat, prudent diet, and they're just garbage science. There were also some epidemiological studies that were very interesting. This was Ansel Keys. He did a 6-country study looking at percent of calories from fat and deaths from heart disease per thousand, and this looks convincing. The countries with a low increase, with low fat consumption had much less heart disease. Now, Ansel Keys was in Italy in the 1950s, and he loved Italy, but he was claiming that they had a low-fat diet. I don't know if he ever ate pizza or linguine with Alfredo, but you know, he was basically lying about the fat consumption in Italy. And in Japan, what he didn't tell people was that in Japan it's very shameful to die of heart disease, but it's very honorable to die of a stroke. And the doctors want to have patients who die an honorable death, and that's what they put on the death certificates. So the death certificates are very unreliable in Asian countries. But here's what Ansel Keys really found. These were all the countries, and what he did was draw the line he wanted and pick the dots that fit the line and eliminated all the rest. This is very common. Another study by Keys showed very interesting country pairs. So we have Middle Europe, Italy, Crete, and Finland. Finland's on the right. So same country, but very different results depending on the part of the country. So like in Finland, people have high cholesterol, quote unquote. And yet in West Finland, the rate of heart disease is very low, and in North Karelia, it was very high. And you had these differences in other countries. So this is really interesting. What you really could have learned something. Was there a difference in the soil? Was there a difference in lifestyle, difference in what they were eating for people of the same genetics in the same country? But they never went back to look at this. One of the things about Finland was, so here in the early 50s, North Karelia had lots and lots of refugees from Russia who lost everything and were living in cement housing, terrible stress, terrible sadness. And sure enough, that was the area with the heart attacks. We also have the Monica study, which showed that basically, if you exclude Japan and China, where the death certificates are very unreliable, there's just no correlation. You can see France with so-called high cholesterol, very low heart disease. Yeah, so it's very unreliable. But in Sweden, when they reported on this study, this is the graph they published. So they just showed 3 dots, okay, and left out all the others. This is 2005. Here we have the countries in Europe. The top graph shows the countries with the, the highest intake of saturated fat. And on the right part is the rates of heart disease. So some of them are pretty high. And then on the bottom graph, you have the countries with the highest consumption of saturated fat. And look at the low rates of heart disease. So look at the bottom one, that's France. High consumption of saturated fat and very low rate of heart disease. That's called the French paradox. Okay, but you have a Swiss paradox, Dutch, Icelandic, Belgian, Finnish, and Austrian paradox. All these paradoxes, maybe there's something wrong with the theory. And as Galileo said, by denying scientific principles, one may maintain any paradox. Well, all this was building up to 1984, the Cholesterol Consensus Conference, which was designed to appear objective and comprehensive. They had been criticized for, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute was criticized for not listening to the critics and the dissenters. So the dissenters were allowed to speak, they were allowed to submit papers, but their views were not included in the panel's report. Now, Mary Enig and a colleague went to this conference, and on the first day they picked up somebody else's papers by mistake, and there was a report there, and it was the final report. So the final report was written before the conference convened, okay? And all the dissenters' names were on there. But the conference concluded that, cholesterol is indeed the culprit. And so what happened here is it looked like the dissenters had finally come around to the consensus point of view. So they tricked them into putting their names on this report. What this conference did was finally define the risk point. Who is at risk? And they decided that anyone with cholesterol over 200 was at risk. Mary overheard an argument between Rifkin, the head of this conference, and 2 other cardiologists. And the 2 cardiologists said, well, we can't make it 200, that's not even average. The average is 250. But Rifkin said, no, we have to make it 200, otherwise we won't have enough people to test and to treat. So they just chose this number. There's nothing scientific about this number, okay? The report called for mass cholesterol screening and recommended the prudent diet, low in saturated fat and cholesterol for at-risk Americans, and now we know who they are, even though no long-term studies had ever been done of such a diet. And specifically, they advised the replacement of butter with margarine. So who do you think is behind all this? Okay. And that launched the National Cholesterol Education Program. It was announced at the conference. The stated goal was to change physicians' attitudes, because they still didn't believe all this. A large physician's kit was sent to all doctors in the United States. You can bet that they were starting to promote drugs for this, because the American Pharmaceutical Association was on the coordinating committee. The dietary recommendations: reduce cholesterol and saturated fat and use margarine instead of butter. I mean, this is a brilliant marketing campaign. They're getting the government and the men in white coats to do their marketing for them. Okay. Now in 1990, they added something else. The National Institutes of Health added to the National Cholesterol Education Program the recommendation of the prudent diet for all Americans above the age of 2. This is not just a mistake or bad advice. This is genocide. This is genocide. How many of you took your 2-year-old in for the doctor's checkup and were told, skim milk, no butter, low-fat diet for your baby? How many? Can you raise your hand high? Yeah. So this was coming from the government and the doctors, and has led to the crisis. It's one of the things that's led to the crisis that we're seeing in our children today. You cannot have reproduction without animal fats. It's just impossible. Okay, here's an ad that appeared, I think this appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association. It's a heart wrapped up with a Fleischmann's corn oil margarine wrapper. Eat to your heart's content. Meanwhile, there were many other studies that refuted this theory. I won't go into them in detail. The Honolulu Heart Program, for example, found no significant differences between fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol intakes of persons with and without heart disease. The International Atherosclerosis Project looked at 31,000 autopsies from 15 countries, and they found no correlation between animal fat intake and the degree of atherosclerosis or the serum cholesterol level. And there were still lots of critics. George Mann, who was a director of the Framingham Project, said, "The public is being deceived by the greatest health scam of the century." And Michael Gurr, a very respected biochemist, said, "Whatever caused heart disease, it is not primarily a high intake of saturated fatty acids." So this is what we call the oiling of America. Butter consumption has plummeted. Who uses lard anymore, right? Except crazy people like us. Shortening consumption has skyrocketed, and the shortening consumption in 1900 or 1910, well, the shortening was included coconut oil and lard, actually, so it was fairly natural. Look at margarine. But the biggest increase was the vegetable oils, the liquid polyunsaturated oils. Now, what's one of the major uses of these oils? Well, it is used in frying, but it's used on salads, right? It's used on lettuce. This is why lettuce causes heart disease, right? And we also had all of this research coming out showing just how dangerous these polyunsaturated oils were. They increased cancer, they increased heart disease. There was a plastic surgeon in LA who interviewed all of his patients, and he found that the ones who had the most wrinkles were the ones deliberately using polyunsaturated oils. They cause liver damage, they're damaging to the reproductive organs in the lungs, and in children they depress learning ability and impair growth. And that's partly because they do in fact lower cholesterol. This was an advertisement for Wesson oil. You can write in and get a cholesterol depressant menu and recipe books. This was in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And here's one for high blood pressure, recommending margarine. There is not a shred of evidence that eating margarine will lower your blood pressure. And this was in the Journal of the American Medical Association. We also have these trans fats that are created out of these polyunsaturated oils. The oils are mixed with a nickel catalyst and put in a huge reactor as big as this, and then they're flooded with hydrogen gas at high temperature, high pressure. What comes out is kind of like cottage cheese. It's got lumps in it. Then they use emulsifiers. They steam clean it to remove the horrible odor, and then they bleach it to get rid of the gray color. And at that point, you have pure vegetable shortening. Then they add artificial flavors, synthetic vitamins. They have to add a natural color, which is very comforting. And this is packaged in blocks and tubs and sold as a health food. Now, it was the work of Mary Enig behind the scenes that finally got them to remove trans fats from the food supply, and this has been done. But what it's done is just gone back to a lot of polyunsaturates. So they're frying all the fries, and about the most dangerous thing you could do is polyunsaturated oils. And the trans fats, like these polyunsaturates, again, they just cause lots of problems, especially in babies. Depressed learning ability, low birth weight, depressed visual acuity. So just to summarize, the polyunsaturated oils cause uncontrolled reactions in the body, and the solid, partially hydrogenated oils inhibit reactions in the body. And if your diet is based on these industrial fats, you're going to have problems. Well, they finally decided that we shouldn't have trans fats in the diet, and there was this big campaign. The press releases said, we're not going to allow trans fats anymore. They're unsafe at any level. They're just as bad as saturated fats. And the whole rest of the press release would be about how terrible saturated fats were. And in fact, they have the opposite effects on the body. For example, the saturated fats encourage inflammation. The saturated fats suppress inflammation. Trans fats depress the immune system. Saturated fats enhance the immune system. And these are the kind of ads that came out equating trans fats with saturated fats. This is World Heart Federation, an advertisement comparing butter to razor blades. And this was an ad showing that cheese is like a mousetrap. You shouldn't eat cheese. And eventually, trans fats were blamed for everything. If you go to the American Kidney Association website, they'll say, don't eat saturated fats, eat this prudent diet. There's absolutely no evidence that saturated fats are bad for the kidneys. So it's just accused of everything, and as a matter of fact, saturated fats are good. They have many very important roles in the human diet, starting with your cell membranes. Your cell membranes need to be 50% saturated fatty acids, or they don't work right. Now we have a new threat, EMF, and if your cell membranes are very robust and have plenty of saturated fat in them, you will be much more able to deal with the EMF. If you're eating polyunsaturates, your cell membranes are going to be kind of floppy and weak, and the structured water against the cell membranes won't work as well to kind of protect you against the EMF. Just looking at disease trends, heart disease has soared, cancer has gone up. All the time that butter consumption is going down. So we don't know everything that causes these diseases, but one thing for sure is it's not butter, because they're going in the opposite direction. Okay, so let's just look at cholesterol for a minute. What is cholesterol? It's often called a fat, but it's not a fat. It's a sterol molecule. It's made by almost every cell in the body. Its key role is to make cells waterproof, so there can be a different chemistry inside and outside of the cell. When you eat a polyunsaturated oil, your cell membranes become kind of floppy or wiggly. They're not stable anymore. And so what your body does is send cholesterol to the cell wall, cell membrane, to shore it up. And that's why the cholesterol levels in the blood go down when you eat polyunsaturates. But it's not a good thing that's happening. Cholesterol is the body's healing substance. It repairs wounds, including tears in the arteries. If you have a weak place in your artery, the cholesterol will go there to shore it up. And blaming cholesterol is a bit like blaming the firemen who've come out to put out the fire. blaming them for the fire. Well, we always find firemen at fires, so they must be the cause of fires, right? So the cholesterol gives structural integrity to your cell membranes. It plays the role of cellulose in plants. It's the precursor to vitamin D. The bile salts needed for fat digestion are made of cholesterol. Cholesterol is a precursor to the vital sex hormones and protective steroids. It's a powerful antioxidant. But more important than any of these really, it is essential for the development and function of the brain and nervous system and needed for the proper functioning of the serotonin receptors in the brain. And this is why mother's milk is so high in cholesterol and contains special enzymes so that the baby absorbs 100% of the cholesterol. Baby formula contains no cholesterol. So our little graph here we call cholesterol the mother of all hormones. All the sex hormones are made out of cholesterol. Testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, DHEA. They're made out of cholesterol, and it's vitamin A, which we get from animal fats, that guides these conversions. On the right-hand side, you have the adrenal cortex hormones that regulate blood sugar levels, that regulate mineral metabolism, that regulate blood pressure levels, okay? And they also help us heal and deal with stress. When we have low cholesterol, it's much harder to deal with stress. And this shows up very often. People with low cholesterol are more angry, they get in more accidents, they're more prone to suicide. So just to summarize our cholesterol research, levels vary, and cholesterol levels increase naturally and gradually with age. This is to protect you, especially against things like cancer. It's very difficult to get an accurate reading of the cholesterol levels. They vary with the amount of stress you're under, the time of day, how long ago you've eaten, and the type of test used. There was one study looking at college students. They were measuring their cholesterol levels every week. And 1 week, everybody's cholesterol went really high. And then they realized that it was midterm exams. They were all under a lot of stress, and the cholesterol was just doing its job to help them make stress hormones so they could deal with this midterm exams. Now, if they had suppressed their cholesterol levels, taken a statin, a cholesterol-lowering drug, they might not have gotten through those exams. They might have stressed out or dropped out because they couldn't deal with the stress. In men, there is a slightly greater risk of heart disease if you have cholesterol levels above 300 if you're under 65. How many men in this room under 65 have a cholesterol level of 300 or above? Nobody. Nobody. Okay? It's a very small percentage of the population. And yet we've got this huge campaign to lower everybody's cholesterol because of this minority, that small minority that has a greater risk of heart disease. There's no appreciable difference for heart disease for cholesterol levels of 180 to 300. That's the vast majority of people. And for women of any age, and for men over the age of 60, there's no difference in heart disease rate for any level of cholesterol. In fact, for women of all ages and for the elderly, higher cholesterol is associated with a longer lifespan. Okay. If you're a woman and a doctor is prescribing a cholesterol-lowering drug, he's incompetent. He doesn't know what he's doing. And if you're older and they're prescribing a cholesterol-lowering drug, they're incompetent. They absolutely don't know what they're doing. And autopsy studies show zero correlation between animal fat intake and degree of atherosclerosis or cholesterol level. What about LDL and HDL? Let's see, the LDL is supposed to be the bad one, is that right? Okay. And no study has shown that elevated LDL is a problem. In fact, there are greater deaths at low cholesterol, low LDL. And there is a type of cholesterol that could be dangerous, and that's oxidized cholesterol. That occurs in powdered milk and eggs, and occasionally in animal fats used for deep frying. So we also know that cholesterol-lowering drugs do not lower the risk of heart disease, but they do increase the risk of cancer, intestinal diseases, depression, suicide, and violent behavior. Now, there's a new way of measuring calcium buildup in the arteries, and when you have a lot of calcium in your arteries, that it's a risk factor for heart disease. Not cholesterol, it's calcium that they're looking at. And this was a study that looked at LDL cholesterol and calcium percentile, and if anything, the LDL is a bit protective. A 2013 Scandinavian study found that higher LDL cholesterol is associated with a longer life. So there's no need to lower LDL with a diet or statin drugs. There actually are over 200 risk factors for heart disease. These include elevated LPA, another type of fat in the blood, elevated homocysteine, type A behavior, loss and bereavement. A lot of people have heart attacks after they lose a spouse or lose a job. Short stature, elevated uric acid. I'm not going to read all of these. Underactive thyroid. Obesity, we know about. Smoking, we know about. We can do things about this. Snoring, okay. Baldness, having a hairy chest, having earlobe creases, having hairy earlobes, you're more at risk. Being poor in a rich country and being rich in a poor country. And elevated cholesterol in some population groups. The point is, a risk factor is not a cause. Lowering your cholesterol is sort of like cutting off your earlobes if they're hairy. It's not going to change your risk, but you just get rid of the risk factor. And we've talked about how they cheat on these studies, exaggerating trivial results, using the concept of relative risk, using graphs of unequal intervals, on and on, cherry picking, poor design, confounding a risk factor with a cause, etc., etc. And this is a photograph. I took this, it was a billboard in the Raleigh-Durham airport. And this is called the Research Triangle. This is where a lot of these studies are done in Raleigh-Durham. And this woman is saying it's all about results. So you're a young doctor, you've just received $1 million grant to study a drug or whatever, and you're so excited, but you're a little bit worried because you know that if you don't get the results they want, they will never give you another grant. So you're kind of walking through the airport with this worry, and then you see this ad for Quintiles, which is an organization that does these studies for you, and they'll get the results you want. Okay. Finally, just a few words on cholesterol-lowering drugs. The type of drugs they use today are called statins. They act on an enzyme to reduce the production of cholesterol in the liver. They come under many names, Lipitor, Zocor, et cetera, et cetera. They were discovered by the Japanese, who found the substance to be very toxic in animal trials. They thought there's no possible use for this. And eventually the patent was sold to Merck, who got FDA approval with unexplained speed. In every rodent study they ever did, statins cause cancer. They are currently being promoted for healthy men and women categorized as at risk because their cholesterol levels are over 200 or even over 180. And if you've had any kind of heart disease event, you are put on a statin because you're at risk even if your cholesterol is low. They have many side effects: fatigue and weakness, memory loss, reduced mental capacity, neuropathy. You have more accidents. muscle wasting leading to back pain and heart failure, very painful, intestinal diseases, pancreatic problems, they're now associated with diabetes, reduced libido because you can't make hormones anymore, you can't make testosterone, depression, accidents, suicide, and cancer. And if you don't believe me, go to this website, askapatient.com, and just search for Lipitor and see what people are saying. They also cause heart failure. Rates of heart failure have doubled since the statins have come into use because the heart is a muscle and the statins reduce muscle function. They also block the absorption of vitamin A, and they reduce the body's production of CoQ10, which is indispensable for normal function of the muscles and the heart. In 2001, the Honolulu Heart Program was published, a 20-year study, and here's what they said in the abstract. Our data accords with previous findings of increased mortality in elderly people with low serum cholesterol, and show that long-term persistence of low cholesterol concentration actually increases the risk of death. Thus, the earlier that patients start to have lower cholesterol, the greater the risk of death. And they want to be treating young men and women with these drugs. And many other studies have confirmed this conclusion. This was an old Lipitor ad, and the fine print says, Lipitor is a prescription drug used with diet to lower cholesterol. It's not for everyone, not for those with liver problems, women who are nursing pregnant or may become pregnant. So how do you know you're going to become pregnant? But here's the clincher. Lipitor has not been shown to prevent heart disease or heart attacks. It'll lower your cholesterol. So they're being very honest here. Now later they got the FDA to rescind this requirement, so they don't have to say that anymore. And the very latest on statins is that they accelerate artery calcification by depleting vitamin K2. So they accelerate atherosclerosis, and they lead to heart failure by depleting CoQ10. The epidemic of heart failure and atherosclerosis that plagues the modern world may paradoxically be aggravated by the pervasive use of statin drugs. And in fact, almost 50% of patients discontinued taking them within 2 years because of side effects. So why are the doctors giving these drugs if they don't work? Because they're paid to. A typical doctor, he's in a practice, they get a bonus at the end of the year that could be up to 50% of their salary. And if they don't prescribe enough statins, they don't get their bonus. But not only that, the rest of the practice doesn't get their bonus. So you can see the tremendous peer pressure on these doctors. They are not free to not prescribe them. I do think that this whole thing is crumbling. The patients are wising up. I have an article on the internet called The Dangers of Statin Drugs, and it is a very highly visited article. Patients are refusing, the doctors are reading these studies, the doctors feel bad about this. I think eventually this is going to crumble. So if it ain't cholesterol, what causes heart disease? And there are many, many theories out there. Dr. Price believed it was a deficiency of the fat-soluble vitamins, refined carbs, trans fats, vegetable oils, oxidized cholesterol, many different deficiencies, including copper deficiency, K2 deficiency, and there's many more. A man named Anand in England felt that it was the pasteurization of milk, homogenization, on and on, coffee consumption, which I tend to agree with, carbon monoxide, pesticides, inflammation, et cetera, et cetera. So why aren't these being studied? Because they can't get money to study these theories. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute is firmly committed to the cholesterol theory and the prudent diet, and they just won't fund anything else. This is an extremely profitable business here. The treatment and testing alone is $100 billion a year. The foods, that's our biggest industry, processed foods, $150 billion a year. Then you have to treat all the diseases caused by the lowering of cholesterol, including cancer. And finally, a very tragic growth industry, growth failure and learning disabilities in children. So I'm a cook. I like to end with a recipe. This is a recipe for a healthcare crisis and enormous profits. What are the ingredients? Greed, envy, ignorance, manipulation, cunning, extortion, lies, and fraud. And here's how you do it. First, conspire to convince the populace that natural whole foods that have nourished mankind for millennia, such as eggs, butter, whole raw milk, and red meat, are dangerous and unhealthy. 2, train the medical profession to advocate antibiotics, vaccinations, fluoride, fabricated foods as scientifically proven methods for preventing illness. 3, ignore or suppress healing methods that work. Claim that real diseases have no cure or do not exist. So you are suffering from chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia, just all in your head, lady, go take an antidepressant. 4, define normal human conditions such as menopause and average cholesterol levels as illnesses which must be treated with expensive drugs that create serious side effects. Then you stew, broil, half bake or boil as the occasion requires, and this serves 300 million people. So that is the oiling of America. Thank you.